welcome to the 2017 Croydon North Candidates Debate from St. Joseph's College, presented and filled live by myself, Timmy, and my co-moderator, David, and our team.
Unlike the ITV Leaders debate last night, we have representatives from all 5 parties today who will debate key elections issues which have been chosen by us on opinion polls for local voters and our own discussions on what is important to us in this election.
Our first candidate is Simon Kasumu, representing the Conservative Party. A round of applause, please.
Our second candidate is Peter Underwood, representing the Green Party. A round of applause, please.
Representing the Labour Party, I'd like to welcome Steve Reid.
The Liberal Democrat candidate in Croydon North is John Pindar. John Pindar can't be with us today, so we are pleased to welcome Alex Davies, who is a Liberal Democrat candidate in Streatham to represent his party.
And last but not least, our fifth candidate is Michael Swadling from UKIP, the UK Independence Party. A round of applause, please, for all of our candidates.
Our first topic today is welfare. If people are on low incomes, if they lose their jobs, or when they get older, many of them in our society depend on help from the government.
We'd like to start each topic by asking each candidate to give us a short statement of about 45 seconds on what their party thinks about this important area.
First of all, we would like to ask the Green Party candidate, Peter Underwood, to make a statement.
Okay, thank you. We're one of the We're one of the richest countries in the world, and to be honest, I think it's a disgrace that there are people left without food or without a place to live. We shouldn't be leaving people in that situation. We've got the money, we could afford to do something about it. In the Green Party, first thing we do is reverse the cruel benefit cuts of the recent government, such as the spare room tax. The fact that young people are now excluded from housing benefit is disgusting. As a person who claimed housing benefit at a younger age, I know how important that is. In the longer term, we'd be moving to a universal basic income, is our main policy, which will provide genuine security for everybody and remove the poverty traps that exist in the current system.
Thank you, Mr. Underwood. Now we'd like to go to the Conservatives, Simon Kasumu.
Yeah, at first probably want to start by talking about my own personal background. So when I was 19 years old, I set up a youth employment charity. And since then, about 10 years ago, we've supported over 40,000 people directly into work. I also oversee all of the self-employment programs of my organisation in the whole of the north of London. So dealing with young people and adults who are unemployed is something that is very important to me. I guess in my opinion, in Croydon North, we have to look at specific local issues that we face and what the barriers are to work. Because ultimately, more people are in work now than ever before. And we know that there are still challenges in terms of making people more employable that we have to deal with. But we are making progress. But in our borough, and specifically in Croydon, unemployment is a big challenge. I think it's a local challenge more than just a national one.
Thank you, Mr. Kasumu.
We'd like to go to the UKIP candidate, Michael Swadling. Can you please give your statement?
So in a similar vein, to just talk about myself, someone that grew up in a council house, I know how important provision from the state is. We have a massive problem in Croydon around housing. It's a national issue, but particularly in Croydon. Huge house costs, we need to bring them down. That will bring down our welfare bill and allow us to target costs more efficiently. We have a problem with wage tax stagnation, where wages have not gone up now for over 10 years. We need to get back control of our labour market so that we can help drive up salaries and really take people out of the need to be on welfare in many cases and make them self-sufficient and earning a good wage.
Thank you, sir. Now we'd like to go to the Labour representative, Steve Reid.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, under the Conservative government for the last 7 years, they have decided to fund massive tax cuts for the rich, by imposing massive cuts in welfare and benefits for the poorest people in our society. So here in Croydon, 1/3 of people who are working don't earn enough to pay the household bills at the end of the month. And instead of helping those families, the Tories cut their support that helps them keep working and keep looking after their families. I had a woman who came to see me in my advice surgery that I hold every week. She was sleeping on the floor in the office where she's a cleaner with her 2 primary-aged children because the Conservative Party cut her benefits. This is one of the richest countries in the world. We can do better for families than leaving them lying on the floor of office blocks.
Thank you, Mr. Reid.
And finally, we'll like the Liberal Democrat candidate, Alex Davies.
Well, let me first of all agree with the premise of your question that we have a responsibility to make sure that in a country that is well off, nobody is in poverty and destitution. And I think that it's right to focus actually on the cost of housing. And if you look at in this borough and in my neighbouring borough of Lambeth, some of the housing conditions in the private rented sector are particularly appalling, and rents are soaring. How do we sort that out? We have to increase housing supply, and to that extent I agree with my colleague on my left. But can you do that if you're leaving the European Union and cutting off the supply of the construction workers that we need to build those homes? No, you can't. 12% of the construction industry comes from European Union countries, and they're not all the same people. They come and go. What's that called? It's freedom of movement, and that's why we must defend it.
Thank you to all of our candidates. We'd now like to ask Joshua to ask a question that will help us to debate this issue further.
With more people using food banks, what would the panic do to reduce inequality in our society, and why is their way the best way for our society?
Can Mr. Kasumu answer that first, please?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, everybody that uses a food bank or who has housing challenges, who is unemployed or who is unemployed, is a travesty in this country. I agree. But we have to have a wider context. 74% of 16 to 64-year-olds are currently in work. We have more people in work than ever before in this country. And ultimately, for us to be able to have good unemployment or full unemployment, we have to have a strong economy. And just to go off something that Steve said, he mentioned that, you know, we have all these big challenges around unemployment since there was a Tory government. But we spent £6 billion on the largest work programme that this country has ever seen since 2010. I think it's very important when you look at the challenges, you appreciate individual stories, but you have to look at the bigger picture and the progress that we have been making.
Would anyone like to add on that?
Well, I think, if I may come in, that one of the issues actually is that governments have too often cut away at working age benefits. Partly, I might say, it's great to have a debate like this because politicians assume that younger people aren't going to be interested in politics and don't vote, and that only older people will. And so you have considerable increases in pensions and then cuts to working age benefits. Now, Lib Dems in their manifesto have committed to keeping those benefits rising in line with inflation, and also to reversing the cuts to housing benefit for the under-21s. So I think that will assist with the issues that you're raising.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Steve Reid, would you like to say anything?
Well, I mean, Joshua, you're quite right to point out the use of food banks has gone up dramatically under this government, and one of the reasons is that wages have gone down. This Conservative government is the first government in 100 years where wages have gone down while they've been in office, not gone up. As I said earlier, 1/3 of families in work in Croydon don't earn enough money to pay the bills at the end of the month and to put food on the table for their children. They go into debt. They go into debt because of the policies of this Conservative government. What they've done is they've given tax cuts for the very rich, and they're proposing more corporation tax cuts for big businesses, and to fund it, they're cutting services like education, the health service, and allowing wages to go down. If they get back in with the blank cheque they want to wreak that kind of havoc on this community, they will continue exactly the way they've been going on for the last 7 years, and this community will sink.
Mr. Underwood, would you like to add?
I was going to come back on one of the points that Samuel raised about getting people into work. I used to work in the Department for Work and Pensions, and I've seen how all the parties have fiddled the figures on unemployment. One of the main issues is the fact they say people are in work, but they're actually on 0 hours contracts. So they're not actually earning any money, they're not actually working, they just class them as in work. So one of the things we do is we ban 0 hours contracts so that people actually have proper jobs. The other thing is, in terms of, talked about people in work in poverty, the minimum wage. Why is the minimum wage below the level of the living wage? The living wage is what people actually need to live on. And so why are we allowing employers to exploit workers by paying them less than they actually need to live? So one of the first things we would raise the minimum wage to the level of the living wage. So that would be at least £10 an hour around London.
Thank you. And last but not least, Mr. Swadling.
Pick up on something both Steve and Peter talked about, which was salaries. Wages are too low, and there's partly a reason for that. Wages have been stagnant for, as I said earlier, over 10 years. And that is because there is a huge supply of workers coming into this country. Now, when you increase the supply of any good or service or of workers, and there isn't necessarily the demand for them, prices go down. In the case of wages, that means salaries have stagnated in this country. There's no plan here to actually deal with that. There's no plan to actually bring in controls on our borders so that we can have a population that we know the size of and actually see British companies invest in workers in this country, people like you in the future, and see wages rise. It's productivity that puts up wages, that puts up salaries. It's not increasing a minimum wage. Making people more expensive if they do not have the skills to fill those jobs makes them unemployed. Productivity increases, employers investing in people, and not being able to tap into cheap overseas pools of workers is what's going to actually improve our future and bring down the welfare bill.
Thank you. We are going to move on to education now. Obviously, that's a subject that's important to all of us here at St. Joseph's and other primary and secondary schools in Croydon.
But education also includes early years learning, universities, and opportunities for adults to continue learning throughout their careers.
So, first of all, we'd like to ask the Conservative candidate, Kasumu, to make a statement.
Well, what is clear is that in Croydon we have an increasing population, a young population, and there is a need for more schools in Croydon and more school places, good school places. And the government has done a lot in the last 7 years to make sure that is the case. One of the things that we've done is we've launched the Free Schools movement, where a community can come together and launch their own schools. We've also allowed schools to become academies, giving them more autonomy. And in a recent manifesto launched yesterday, we've ensured that there will be extra money for schools. So we are doing what we can. But ultimately, for you to have good school places in North Croydon, you need to have a Conservative Member of Parliament that can bat for you in what will probably be Theresa May's government on June the 8th.
Thank you. Peter Underwood, you seem to be in disbelief about his comment. Would you like to comment?
Nonsense. I mean, in terms of statement, education is everybody's right, and everybody should be able to enjoy education. We provide free early years education preschool. We'd scrap SATs and Ofsted so that teachers can actually get back to teaching and children can enjoy their classes as opposed to just being forced through endless exams, which don't actually improve education, as lots of evidence have shown. Later on, we'd restore the educational maintenance allowance so that people can afford to go on sixth form education, and we'd scrap university tuition fees for people who wanted to go through the academic route. We'd also guarantee proper apprenticeships for people who wanted to go through the skills route, so that everybody has a chance to carry on learning. The point I was going to we'd bring education back under public control. We don't want privatisation of education, giving out schools to academies and private companies. We want public control over our institutions so they work together rather than competing against each other.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Swadling, would you like to add anything?
Yes, certainly. I've been a school government borough for some years now. Education's clearly hugely important issue. Academies, I commented to someone earlier, schools are much better than when I was at school. We often think that things have got worse, but education, schools I visit, schools I've been in, are massively better than they were 20 years ago. Pupil behaviour, and some of your teachers might wish to differ on this, is hugely improved from when I went to school. We've got some really great specialist schools in Croydon. I've been a governor in the special needs sector for a long time, and depending on need, we have different schools. We have the Brit School in Croydon for specialisms. But we need more specialist schools, schools that specialise in academia, like grammar schools, and in technical training. And lastly, I'll just very quickly say, picking up on Peter's point, academies work. They have been great for our schools in Croydon. We have seen schools that have been problematic for as long as I've been in the borough improve in a short period of time by changing to some great academy chains.
Thank you. Peter, again, would you like to add anything?
All the evidence shows that academies haven't improved schools. The other thing that don't take into account is the government has pumped millions of pounds into academies that they've taken out of other schools. So while they're pumping all the resources into academies to make their privatisation project look good, that's starving resources from actually state schools. We want to reverse everybody deserves a decent education. That's why they should all be funded in exactly the same way.
Thank you. Steve Reed, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, thank you, yes. And we don't have to imagine what a Tory MP would do in Croydon, because we've already got 2 Tory MPs in Croydon, and you can look at what they've done on education. And what they've done is they've voted to cut Croydon schools by £20 million over the next 2 years, and they voted to hand an extra 15 million to Hertfordshire, which is where the Conservative candidate lives and which is a far wealthier community than Croydon North. Now, the effect of that is that schools like this one are losing money from their budget, which means they're losing teachers, teaching assistants, and funding for extracurricular activities. St Joseph's College, under the latest Tory plans, stands to lose a further £286,000. St Joseph's Junior loses £80,000. St James the Great loses £165,000. Harris Crystal Palace loses over £1 million if you have a Tory MP going and voting for this. And what it's meaning is that the futures of our children are being wrecked, so the Tories can fund the futures of children living in far better off areas. It's not fair. Croydon deserves better than that.
Can I just say, I was just wondering when the time would come that Steve would turn to partisan politics focused on whether or not the Tories are these evil people that live in towers. First of all, we're not. Secondly,
excuse me, Mr. Reid.
Secondly, if you read our manifesto yesterday, you will find that we've committed a further £6 billion to the education budget. Thirdly, and more importantly, I am a school governor of a primary school. I understand how budgets work. It's very easy to start throwing figures at people.
And that's enough.
But we are protecting the education budget. We have always done so.
Lib Dem, have you got anything else to say? Sorry.
Well, education is one of the things that got me interested in politics in the first place, because I actually noticed, even during my own schooling, which is quite a long time ago now, the very stark difference that what your home background was like made to your likely achievement at school. And it's always struck me that what you can do in the early years with children to make sure that they can achieve better in later years is incredibly important, which is why the Lib Dems want to triple what we call the early years pupil premium. It's extra money that follows the most disadvantaged children to £1,000 per pupil per year. And also to reverse the cuts which Steve has talked about and protect per pupil spending in real terms each year. Because this is investment that actually stands in the future. The good schooling, of course, means people getting better jobs, producing more income and more tax in later years. So it makes sense economically, and it's right for everybody to get that education that they deserve.
Thank you. We would now like to ask Safe to ask a question that we think is particularly important to the candidates to answer.
What do the panel feel about the Conservatives' pledge that by 2020, 75% of students and by 2025, 90% of students will have to study the EBAC qualifications, and this will be their only choice? Do they feel this meets the needs of all students?
Could Steve Reid please answer that question, please?
Well, I think it's bonkers, to be honest, to push every child down an academic route when many young people need to learn vocational skills that will get them into work. The Tories have adopted a very, very blinkered attitude towards education. which is that only academic study works. Actually, 50% of jobs, and Germany has shown us this, depends on a high-quality vocational education route. So that's where we should be looking. But it's not only that. The Tories have already trebled tuition fees. So students from this school that want to go to university will end up with a £40,000 debt on average if they go to university. My nephew tells me he's not going to go to university because of what the Tories are doing, and I imagine many young people in this school are having to think twice about whether they can afford that kind of debt. The Labour Party will abolish tuition fees if we're elected on the 8th of June and give every child the same chance that I got for a funded higher and further education.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Sounds great, but can I just say one thing? It was Labour that brought in tuition fees, not the Tories, firstly. Secondly, there are a lot of people going to university increasingly, and I think it should be an opportunity for everybody that needs to or wants to go to university to do that. But university is not for everyone. And the bigger challenge that we have is those who don't want to go to university don't feel that they have alternatives that make sense for them. And this is why the government has committed over £2 billion to promoting and developing excellent apprenticeships. But what I would say on this particular point when it comes to EBAC is, regardless of whether you go to university or not, we are in a global race. And in this global market, Britain that spends so much money on education, whether you agree that we should spend more on it or not is a philosophical question or a question for something else. But we are in a global race, and we are towards the bottom of league tables across the world for subjects like maths, English, and science. And I believe, and I truly believe, that whether you go to university or not, or whether you want to have a technical, vocational career, you still need a strong foundation. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with it having an EBAC qualification or a bunch of subjects, when you move on.
Alex Davies, would you like to add anything?
Well, Samuel says there's nothing wrong with having an EBAC qualification, but there plainly is something wrong with restricting students' choice. When do people learn best? They learn best when they're learning the things in which they are interested.
Mr. Kasumu, can you please let him speak?
Once you move on,
Mr. Kasumu, can you please let him speak? Mr. Kasumu.
Well, I think the difference between us is that I trust students to choose the things that they will most be interested in and most want to learn and which they will find most useful in their lives, and you don't. Well, I think that we should give students the choice, because they will then learn better and they will do better as a result. I have to say that the question of how much money is going into schools is not a philosophical question. It's a very hard practical question for schools like this one, which will have to cut teaching or teaching assistant staff as a result. That's the reality. So you can't say, oh, it's just a sort of philosophical question where we're all just sort of floating and thinking, would it be nice to fund schools better? It's a hard, practical question and a hard reality for schools like this one.
Marcus Swadling, do you have anything to add, please?
I think it's really, there's a lot of agreement on this side here. EBAC's fine, fantastic, if that's the choice you make. The best people to make a choice about your lives and your education are you and your family, not the education minister, not the government. We should be a huge amount of diversity in education qualifications, possibly with some kind of pooling together that you can see a way of comparing, but you should be able to choose the qualifications that best suit you. Somebody in an office in Whitehall deciding that for the vast majority of pupils in this country is fundamentally wrong. I would say it's fundamentally unconservative, but maybe that's what that party now is.
Already today, we've heard a lot about money, whether it's welfare, education, Brexit, or the National Health Service. Everything needs to be paid for.
And if it needs to be paid for by the government, it's going to have to be funded by our parents' taxes. Could I ask Steve Reid from the Labour Party to start us off on this topic?
Yeah, I'll tell you a very interesting thing about our economy is it's the only advanced industrial Western economy that has grown for the last 10 years, but where wages have gone down. So the economy is growing, that means there's more money, but wages on average in real terms have gone down. So where's the money gone? It's gone to the super rich and the people who own the big corporations. And what the Conservatives are proposing at this election is to reduce tax for those people. Again, the very wealthiest. And the way they're going to fund that is they're going to put tax up for everybody else. They already tried in the budget to increase national insurance contributions for the self-employed, hairdressers, plumbers, taxi drivers. They are not ruling out increases in income tax at this election on average and lower income earners, because that is their plan. Labour will fund our pledges by increasing corporation tax on big business and asking those who earn over 80,000 to pay a little bit more. Everyone else will not pay more to fund our plans. It will be the rich, the people that the Conservatives seek to protect always.
Thank you. Can we please go to Peter Underwood of the Green Party?
Taxation is how we keep things running in this country. If you're cutting taxes, you're cutting corners somewhere. You're cutting public services. So the continual tax cuts that the Tories keep putting forward, that's what we can see how it's destroying our public services in this country. We believe in the Green Party in a tax system where everybody pays their fair share. We cracked down on tax parasites, the people who take out the system but then use fancy accounting to avoid paying any tax back in, and the tax traitors who move their money offshore to pay tax to a foreign government rather than actually paying in this country. I agree with Steve. People with more money should pay more tax. We would similarly increase higher taxes based on direct taxation, so it's based on people's income, not increasing things like VAT, which hit the poorest hardest. So we need to focus on people who've got more money and the bigger businesses. We'd also tax unearned income. So that's wealth tax on the top 1% wealthiest, and a Robin Hood tax on the transactions in the financial sector, which would bring in billions of pounds without hurting the economy at all.
Thank you, Mr. Underwood. Now to the Conservative, Mr. Kasumu.
Yeah, first of all, I think everyone should pay their fair share of tax, including the rich, who should always bear the highest burden when it comes to taxation. But ultimately, for our parents and to pay the least amount of tax, or the most appropriate amount of tax, we have to control spending. It's all good saying, you know, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, get rounds of applause, but if you can't fund all of your promises, the only way you're going to be able to do that is borrow more so that we end up paying, the younger generation ends up paying for it in the future, or you increase taxes. Or you increase taxes, yes. So the reality is the Conservatives are the only one that will allow us to have that equilibrium going forward. And as you've mentioned, Steve, the economy has grown over the last 7 years, which means that we clearly are doing something correct.
Why are you cutting corporation tax then?
Why
are you putting up taxes on ordinary working people?
We're not cutting, but we have cut.
Corporation tax cuts.
It's a good question. Let me answer the question. We're not cutting, but we have cut corporation tax, yes, because we want to encourage more people to set up businesses and to generate wealth,
not
to create jobs.
This is corporations. This is the Googles and the Ubers. You're charging more tax to small businesses.
Good question. Where's Google's headquarters in the UK? It is in Ireland. It's not even in the United Kingdom. It's in the Republic of Ireland. Why is that? Because they want to dodge tax. But if you increase corporation tax even more, like Jeremy Corbyn wants to do, what is going to happen? More and more businesses are going to leave our country. So it's all good saying that, but you've got to be realistic.
They're already in this country.
You've got to be realistic. They're in the country. They're in the country, but they're not paying tax in the country. Why is that?
Tax to the country. That's the point.
We'd like to go to the Liberal Democrats, please.
Okay, well, I think that listening to the exchanges there, the thing is that the elephant in the room about taxation is that this government is about to pursue the hardest and most extreme form of Brexit that it possibly could. That's going to cost our economy a huge amount of money. You know, the financial services industry paid £24 billion in tax in the last financial year. They're not popular, but if you ruin the single market, then you will end up with less tax coming in, and we end up in a position where we try and turn Britain, as the Conservatives seem to want to, into some kind of bargain basement tax haven. Now, with the Lib Dems when in government, the principle that we pursued was to try to make sure that you increase the level at which people start paying tax, so that those who are earning least pay no tax at all, and we did achieve that in government, and we'd like to see that continue.
Thank you. Can Mr. Swadling please give his statement?
Number of comments made about taxing, about tax rates. The issue is not tax rates, it's how much revenue we produce. If anyone here studies economics, or you may go on to at some future point, the Laffer curve. If tax is 100% or tax is 0%, you raise no tax. If tax is 10% or it's 90%, you actually raise more tax at 10%, because people will work. You can lower tax rates and increase tax revenue and have more money to spend on all of the good things that we're going to be talking about here today. That's what we need to be doing, is finding that right point where we can bring down tax rates, give you more freedom with your own money, and increase the revenue we need to pay for health, education, policing and all of those other important services. I will just make one last point, the hardest form of Brexit. We voted to leave. It's time you accept that. It's time a party with the Democrats in their name accepts the democratic mandate of the people of Britain.
The single market was not on the ballot paper last
The single
June,
market is
and
a fundamental part of being in the European
said
Union.
that we could remain in the single market, and that's now being jumped. That's what's
and we
happening.
did, and we will.
Okay, we'll go over to Ethan now for our question.
Do the panel feel it is fair to treat someone who is earning £80,000 a year living in London the same as someone living somewhere else where the cost of living is much cheaper?
Labour, would you like to start that topic, please?
Clearly it isn't. I mean, the woman I mentioned before, the woman that was sleeping on the floor of an office block with her 2 primary school-aged children, was left there because her housing, she was in work, so she was working, but she didn't earn enough, so she got some benefit support. Her benefit support got cut. She got kicked out of her house by her landlord, and they ended up homeless. That's why they were sleeping on the floor. And the reason that happened is the Conservatives put the same level of benefit cap on people living in London, where housing costs are very, very high, as people living in, say, Blackpool or Scarborough, where housing costs are very, very low.
That's not
and
true.
The reason they're doing
that is not true.
And the reason,
that is a lie.
Yes, it is. It's disproportionately different. It's disproportionately different. And what is happening is they are deliberately socially cleansing London. They're trying to push poorer people out of London into other parts of the country where there is less work available. They're trying to push people out of this city and push them into places in the country where there are no jobs for them to do. They're increasing people's misery right across the country. And here in Croydon, it meant that 2 primary school-aged kids that deserve a bed for the night in their own secure home so that they can get an education were denied that chance in one of the richest cities that has ever existed on planet Earth. And it is a disgrace, Samuel, a disgrace.
Thank you. Mr. Kasumu. Mr. Kasumu, what would you like to add to that?
First of all, I'm not sure the host should be clapping when an MP makes a point. Anyway, nobody should be homeless. We clearly have a big housing issue in London, a fundamental issue because house prices are rising. They've stabled over the last year, but they're still far too high. And the reason for that is clearly because we need to build more houses. And that is not a Conservative or Labour issue. This is an issue that has started way back in the 50s. Now, when it comes to £80,000, is that a lot of money? For most of us, yes, it is. But for some people, particularly those living in London, if you have more than one child and they are of a particular age and you're paying childcare fees and and the like, and you're living in particular areas, that is not a lot of money. And what I don't like is when people decide to have the politics of class when they want to put one person against the other. Ultimately, we need a rich economy full of wealth creators and more if we're going to be able to have a country that is stable and people living the lives and spending the money on things they need to spend.
Thank you. Peter Underwood.
I was going to say, I mean, the point of somebody's earning £80,000 a year, they are amongst the richest people in the country. That's a fact. So in terms of them paying more tax, that obviously makes sense. You talked about the cost of living. That's one of the other things we need to look at. You said about housing. The Tories haven't been building any housing. They've been building investment opportunities, huge blocks of flats in Croydon, full of these huge tower blocks full of flats that nobody in Croydon can afford. This isn't housing. This is just, say, investment opportunities for foreign investors. We need to get back to building social housing for rent that people can rent out at a reasonable rate, living rents, so that people can afford to live in London, so that their costs are reduced, and so we can go back to looking at their income in terms of so they're taxed appropriately.
Thank you. We'll go to Alex Davies now.
I think it's slightly astonishing to hear a Conservative candidate for Croydon say that £80,000 is not a lot of money. I think that to basically anybody in Croydon or the neighbouring borough, they would think that is a very considerable sum indeed. The question was about should tax rates be different in different parts of the country, which I think is an interesting idea. I'll tell you why I'm cautious about it. One of the things that the Conservatives are absolutely trying to do is to try to regionalise pay in the public sector, so as an excuse to cut pay in all sorts of, in all around the country for teachers and nurses. So I think if we get into this argument that we'll change tax rates on a regional basis, that will feed that. Having said that, Lib Dems are advocates of devolved government, and if we could make it work, I would like to see stronger government around the regions. I'd like to see more power for the London Assembly and Mayor, for example, and that might get us to a point where we have more of our taxation decided at a regional level and less in Westminster for the whole country.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. And last but not least, to Mr. Swadling.
So I'd say again, that take out that point of taxing people differently based on where they are, I think is not something we can reasonably do. 80,000 is a very good salary. I think it puts you in probably about the top 5% of income earners. However, around here, why is that question relevant? It's because 80,000 doesn't buy you a family home in this part of Croydon, in fact, in any part of the borough. 80,000 doesn't cover the rent on a family home, would struggle to cover the rent on a family home in large parts of the borough. We've got a real problem in London around house prices. Huge part of that problem is we're not building enough houses. We need 250,000 a year. We've never got above 150,000 in recent years. But the other side of that is too much demand. We need to stop bringing in hundreds of thousands of people a year, increasing demand for property in this country that is making any sort of house or home simply out of reach of ordinary people.
Thank you. Now on to health and the NHS. However hard we try to stay fit and healthy, there are times when we need to visit our GP or go into hospital. And doctors and nurses are there at the key points throughout our lives, from when we're born to when we have our own children to when we die.
Alex Davies, could you please make your statement, please, on the behalf of the Liberal Democrats?
Well, I agree with the premise again of the question. The simple fact about the NHS is that it's going to need more money to fund it. We have an ageing population. We're able to keep people alive for longer. We've got increasing medical technologies and research that is enabling us to live longer lives, and that's a good thing. But if we want an NHS that will serve us all and give us all our families the healthcare that we want, we are going to have to pay a little bit more for it. And that's why the Lib Dems in this election are proposing to add a penny to each of the rates of income tax, including the top rates, so that we can raise £6 billion a year to put the money into the NHS that's needed to stop the crisis, to stop people having to hang around on trolleys for hours and hours and hours when they should be being treated, to make sure that we've got the doctors and nurses that we need, and in particular to make sure that we are funding social care properly. Because at the moment we have people staying in hospital when they could be in the social care service, and we also have carers being paid an absurdly low amount for the work that they do.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Could we go to Labour, please?
Yeah, well, for me, the NHS and the future of our NHS here in Croydon is one of the very top issues in this election. Because when the Conservatives were first elected in 2010, they said they would protect our NHS. They then imposed the biggest top-down reorganisation in the NHS's history that wasted £3 billion, and every single year they have underfunded the NHS. So it is now getting 20% less funding in real terms than when David Cameron first walked into Downing Street. Croydon is funded less than the London average, and because of that, there's now a consultation on the future of hospitals in South West London, and the consultation says that South West London, in their words, can no longer afford 5 hospital sites. The preferred option is a reduction to 4. And of those 5 hospitals, which is Epsom, Kingston, St Helier, St George's in Tooting and the Mayday in Croydon, only St George's is protected. So the Conservatives have listed Croydon University Hospital, the Mayday, for closure or downgrading if they are re-elected, and the NHS has already agreed £36 million of cuts for Croydon NHS alone next year. That is enough to pay the wages of 1,000 nurses. Croydon's NHS is under threat. Only a vote for Labour will protect our hospital, protect our nurses, and protect our doctors here in Croydon.
Thank you.
Can I just say, firstly, that £21 million is going to be invested in the emergency services in Croydon North. Fact. Right? Number 2, £8 billion yesterday was committed in real terms as additional funding for the NHS. Fact. Another thing, 140,000 NHS staff that are from the European Union are a priority group that will be protected as part of the Brexit negotiation.
Mr. Reid.
Now, on Steve's point of Mayday Hospital, let me be absolutely clear. As somebody who knows, first of all, people who are in the current government, Mayday Hospital is not going to be shut. Steve knows this. Steve knows this as well. They like to say Conservatives like to spend money. Would you put £21 million into something that you are going to close down?
You did it in Lewisham.
Would any of you do that?
It's
absolute nonsense, and he knows that strategically there is absolutely no way that Mayday Hospital is going to be cut.
Why hasn't it got protected status?
What I would say is it looks good on Steve's leaflets. It makes him sound great and passionate and get some rounds of applause, but he and I know that that hospital isn't going anywhere.
It's listed for closure.
Steve, would you like to reply to his comment?
It's an NHS consultation document. I didn't write it. It's on the NHS website. Any of you go there, Google STP, South West London, and look at the document, pages 27 to 32, make it clear. 5 hospitals will reduce to 4. Only St George's is protected. The other 4 are therefore options for closure or downgrading. And the 36 million cuts in our NHS next year has already been agreed. That isn't even a consultation. It's been agreed. That's 1,000 nurses we're going to lose if he gets his chance to go into Parliament and put his hands up to trash the Mayday.
Can I just say very quickly, Steve and I both know which hospital is going to close.
Which one? Tell me. Tell us which one. Tell us which one, Samuel. He says he knows.
Can we hear from Mr. Underwood, please?
I was just saying, and it's a point where I disagree with Steve on his vote Labour to save the NHS. I support the NHS.
Mr. Kasumu, please.
I support the NHS Reinstatement Act, which Steve didn't sign up to, which will roll back the privatisation of the NHS. Actually, you vote Green Party to get publicly owned, properly funded and free at the point of access health services. The other differentiation with all of the parties stood here is that they all quite happily voted to renew Trident. They're happy to spend billions of pounds on killing people, on a weapon we should never use. So it isn't just about raising taxes. We could cut 30 billion is being spent up front for Trident that we could use on public services like the NHS, 150 billion over the course of Trident's life that we could spend on actually improving health rather than killing people.
Mrs. Swadling.
Well, I think just to pick up on that point, protecting our freedom, protecting our nation is an absolutely critical service of government and one obviously the Green Party doesn't feel capable of doing. On the NHS, we do need more money spent. There isn't a magic pot of money to take that from. There is, however, the 0.7% of GDP we spend on overseas aid. We could bring that money back into this country. It doesn't need to go to India, that can fund its own space programme. It doesn't need to go to Ethiopia for their pop groups. We can bring that money, cut spending on overseas aid as part of GDP, and recruit 20,000 more nurses, 8,000 more GPs, and scrap hospital parking fees. A very simple way to improve our health service from funding that's already there.
Thank you.
Really worried about UKIP adopting the BNP policies. Everything's the fault of immigrants. Cut money to anybody who's a foreigner.
That's not BNP
policy.
Racism. Sorry, this is. You wondered the point.
Mr. Swadling, please can you have a chance to speak? Please can you have a chance to speak?
Just the National Front in a different
Mr. Swadling, please can you have a chance to speak?
Every member of the BNP is excluded from ever being in UKIP. Is that true for your party, Mr. Underwood? Is that true for your party? No, it isn't.
Mr. Swadling, please. Okay. And we have a question now on the topic of health from Yusuf.
There is widespread media attention about the state of the NHS, and recently 2,000 senior doctors have warned that they feel patient safety is at risk due to lack of funding in NHS. What do the panel feel is the best way to deal with the problems in the NHS?
Liberal Democrats, would you like to answer that, please?
Well, Samuel started to try to list some facts. Listen, these are the facts. People are sitting about on trolleys when they should be in hospital beds. We are losing NHS staff. The waiting times are longer. Your government is in fact proposing to scrap even the waiting time targets. Those are the facts in the NHS, and the question is, how can we sort it out? I'm afraid it is going to need more money, and that's why we're proposing a targeted tax rise where everybody can see in their payslip why they're paying a little bit more for the NHS. I think it's widely supported, actually, because people want an NHS that is funded and that they can rely on and that their families can rely on. But we have to pay for it.
Mr. Reid, would you like to add to that?
It's very simple. the Tories are funding the cuts in corporation tax for big business by cutting public services like education and our NHS. That's why it's happening. They're taking things away from you, like education, and from people who need healthcare, and they're using it to give even more money to some of the richest people that have ever existed on planet Earth. But Samuel said a very interesting thing earlier. He said, of the 4 hospitals listed for closure, which includes Croydon University Hospital, he said he knows which one is going to close. Now, would you like to tell us? Because voters in Croydon North would be very reassured to hear from you, and you said you've been speaking to ministers, which hospital they're really going to close, because the rest of us don't know. So would you like to share it with us?
What I'd like to share is that I'm running to be the MP for Croydon North, so my business is to represent the constituents of Croydon North.
And which hospital is
not any
closing?
other. So
You said you know.
I will let the other people running for the other seats
Which one?
speak for that.
Which one?
Just to
you
answer
said you know.
the question.
He said ministers have told him.
Please,
Just to answer your
We
question.
need to know.
Just to answer your question. One thing that I believe and I'm absolutely clear about is money is not the answer to every problem in this world. We have committed to spending an extra £8 billion on healthcare over the next Parliament in real terms, in addition to the budget that was already set. But what I would say is that ultimately people are living longer. We are healthier. And as a result, there is increasing strain on the NHS. Now, what the Prime Minister announced yesterday was the removal of something called the triple lock, which means that wealthy pensioners will no longer benefit from certain state benefits, and as a result, more money can be invested in, making the improvements to the NHS that people want. But money is not the only answer. Let that be absolutely clear. And Steve did attack the transformation programme that we have done during the last Parliament. But the reality is, somebody has to try to bring about solutions.
Could you wrap up, please?
In our world, if you don't try, you never succeed.
Why won't you tell
we
us
try
which
to
one's
bring
gonna
about the
stop?
transformations that we need.
Mr. Underwood, you seem to be stuck.
And we'll continue to try.
Disgusted by the traditional Tory selfish attitude. We've got a hospital, don't care about anybody else.
Then-
So as long as he thinks he's
Mr.
got a hospital
Kasumu,
in where he
please.
wants to be, he doesn't care what happens to anybody else. Same thing, take money off some pensioners to pay something else.
Rich pensioners.
Mr. Kasumu, please.
And the alternative is to
Mr.
bankrupt the
Kasumu,
country
let him
again
speak.
like Labour did.
Mr. Kasumu.
And it will come and clean up the mess
There
like
is
we always do.
Billions of pounds being wasted in the NHS at the moment because of the enforced marketisation, trying to enforce market models on a natural monopoly, which any of you who've studied economics will realise is just stupid. But that's what the Tories have been doing, and that wastes somewhere between 4 and 30 billion. We're not quite sure because it's just massive amounts that it's just wasted. So we'd reverse that by getting rid of all the privatisation. We'd also work with health professionals. None of this imposing things from the top and without talking to people. We talk to doctors, we talk to people who work in the health service to work out where the money is needed. Things are changing. We've got an ageing population. We need more money into mental health, but we'd be talking to the people who know what they're doing rather than just being politicians making stupid speeches.
And finally, we'll have Mr. Swadling to give his thoughts and opinions.
Yes, thank you for the question. There's actually one of the major problems facing hospitals at the moment is bed blocking. People, particularly elderly people, in relatively expensive NHS beds where they could be in what are relatively cheaper social care beds. Cuts to council budgets and a lack of local accountability means that people that could be in a cheap bed are stuck in an expensive bed. One of the things UKIP will do is bring the social care budget under the control of the NHS, so that with the same pot of money we can get a more efficient use of the beds we've got across those two systems and get people out of hospital and into the respite care they need sooner and actually free up vital funds and services in our hospitals.
Just before we go on to the next topic, I would like to tell all of you that if somebody is speaking, please let them finish their point before you then interrupt. Then you can get your point across. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final topic today is crime. Whether there's enough police on our streets, to what punishment criminals should receive, there are a number of ways in which crime is a key area of the government policy.
Michael Swadling, could you please start off with a statement from the UK Independence Party?
I'll start with a statement about a local problem, knife crime. In Croydon, this is, and in fact across London, but talking about here, it appears to me almost every week we see another sad story of a stabbing. I was at a meeting with the new borough commander, and he talked about some of the issues he's seeing where people are going to school with knives, families are almost, in some cases, enabling that, where people have been victims of knife crime, they're going back on the street with knives. We need a big change. It may not be universally popular in this room, as unfortunately it will affect you more than it will affect someone like me. But we really need to get back into stop and search from the police, looking at where they see and fear people that may be about to commit crimes and actually taking action, because we cannot let this large amount of knife crime go on. I just had one last thing. We're going to get a huge dividend from leaving the European Union. Something like £10 billion a year net contribution from leaving the EU. That, among other things, will fund 20,000 more police for our streets, and a huge important step forward in helping reduce crime.
Thank you, Mr. Swadling. Would you like to go to the Liberal Democrats, please?
Well, I'll pick up on the point about knife crime, and I don't agree about stop and search, because stop and search is one of the things that has ruined the relationships between the police and communities. And I think, why do people carry knives? They carry them because they don't feel safe. And in order to feel safe, you have to feel that you've got a police force and a police presence that you trust and that you recognise. So I don't think that we should ruin community relations by going back 20 years on stop and search. I do think, though, that we need to increase funding to the police, and the Lib Dems have costed in their manifesto another £300 million for police each year, which would mean £62 million in London. I also think that we've got to address some of the issues around crime and the way in which we sentence people with a view to people's health and well-being. Because personally, as a Liberal, I don't believe that people are born bad. So if people are committing crime, there's a reason for it, and we have to address those reasons, particularly in young people. And so that we would, for example, allow the Youth Justice Board, which deals with youth crime in a different way to the courts, to commission mental health services as well as merely punish by sending to prison or community service.
Thank you. And Mr. Reid, your statement?
Yeah. Croydon was one of the areas that was hit hardest in the riots just a few years ago, and the day after the riots struck, we had David Cameron as the Prime Minister and Boris Johnson as the Mayor of London in Croydon North, telling us they would look after our community and keep us safe. What they then did was they closed every single police station in Croydon North. They cut the number of police on our streets, and they cut neighbourhood policing from 7 uniformed officers in every ward to just 1 or 2. That was the eyes and the ears on the ground removed by the Conservatives. Now we are seeing an increase in knife crime. It's very, very frightening indeed. We need to put back the police on the streets because people need to see that, but we also need funding to have early intervention in families where there is, say, domestic violence or siblings getting involved in gang crime, and we need to fund communities to take action themselves. I set up the country's biggest community youth trust to try and start working on that kind of project. The Tories have cut their funding, and the way they've done it is that the 10 poorest councils in Britain have had cuts 17 times bigger than the 10 richest, so they've taken money away from precisely those communities that have the biggest problem with crime and knife crime. Makes no sense.
Thank you. To the Conservatives, please.
Yeah, I'll never forget, about 10 years ago, I'd just become Vice President of my student union. I was really happy, I was the first person to get 1,000 votes for a contested seat. And as I was walking away, I received a phone call that one of my best friends had been, prosecuted and went to prison for violent crime-related issue. And at that point, that really changed my life and made me realize that, I had to do more to try and find solutions to the challenges that people from backgrounds similar to myself faced. Now, what I would say is, first of all, I agree with Alex that we need to somehow build better relationships with the police and wider communities. And I kind of agree with Steve to an extent that there is a need for more projects and programs. But I guess ultimately, the big issue that I find, and on Monday I spoke to a lot of former gang members in Croydon North, and the big issue I find is that there is not enough access to role models and mentors. And I have developed a 10-point plan, which I hope to, launch at some point. But one of the key things I think is there needs to be a national program that, allows people, particularly people from single-parent backgrounds, young men, to have father figures and role models to tell them about what they can do and to instill a sense of belief so they can, chart a different course to what they currently do.
Thank you. Mr. Underwood, your statement?
I agree the fact that a lot more work needs to go into preventing crime in the first place. There's far too much focus on just locking up people, maximum number of people. Well, may have a 10-point plan. There's been a £400 million cut from youth services since 2010. So I don't know where he's going to get the money for these special 10-point plan and activities. These services have been decimated that used to give people those opportunities to find other routes, to talk to other people, and prevent people going into crime in the first place. Our system isn't working. About a quarter of offenders re-offend within a year once they're released. 40% of young offenders re-offend. So just putting people in prison isn't actually making our society any safer. We need to look at rehabilitation, helping those people, and things like drugs, treating it as a health issue, not a crime issue. So we're actually moving away from just punishing people and actually making our society safer.
Can I just say very, very quickly that the government, unfortunately, will not have all of the solutions to dealing with the challenges that we face on our streets. In fact, more often than not, where I have seen things be successful and lives changed, the government has had very limited involvement. So we need to find a way to encourage more communities, more leaders, more role models to get involved and get stuck in. Money doesn't fix every single challenge. In fact, I'm sure most of you are from very good homes. And the fact that you are here, articulate, clever young men, has very little to do with what the government funding gave to a charity somewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Kasumu. And last but not least, very quickly.
What Samuel's saying here is right, but communities need some funding to make those things happen. They need to book spaces, they need to bring in support and services. But last year, the Conservatives cut Croydon £45 million, but handed 24 million extra to Surrey, which is far wealthier. They have nothing like the problem with violent youth crime and gang crime that we have, and yet you took money away from this community and you gave it to Oxted and the Surrey Hills. It makes absolutely no sense. You need to put the money behind what you're saying, otherwise the communities will simply collapse. They need some resource and support to do the things you're talking about, or it will never happen.
Thank you, everyone. Our final question from the Year 9 debate team comes from Sam.
Although we are a Catholic college, we welcome all faiths. With over 40% of our boys being Muslim, what does the panel feel should be done to address the increased risk of terrorism without making this an issue of faith?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that question.
Could you repeat it, please, Samuel?
Although we are a Catholic college, we welcome all faiths. With over 40% of our boys being Muslim, what does the panel feel What does the panel feel should be done to address the increased risk of terrorism without making this an issue of faith?
Really good question.
Mr. Kasumu, would you like to answer that?
I guess personally I'm a committed Christian, but I'm very passionate about how people of the Islamic faith are treated in this country, particularly Muslim women. I feel like more often than not, they face barriers that politicians across the political divide do not pay enough attention to. Terrorism is, I guess, a very live issue, but if you look at, a lot of people involved in knife crime, you'd find that a lot of their parents, for example, go to church. So in my opinion, I think faith communities need to be better understood and also engaged with better and supported to I guess, increase the impact that they can have on the wider community. So that's what I would do. I think terrorism is not necessarily just a Muslim or Islamic challenge. It's a global challenge, and also there are local issues and reasons why someone will go to terror that is outside of a mosque. For example, are they in work? Do they have a good education? Do they have good role models? None of this has anything to do with whether or not they've been attending Friday prayer.
Thank you. Mr. Reid, would you like to add?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And people getting involved in terrorism are a tiny, 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 tiny minority. And it is clearly wrong to smear an entire community for the actions of a tiny minority. And I think the media need to take some responsibility here. I did a survey about how Muslims are reported in the media, and something like 80% of all mentions of Muslim people are negative. Now, if people are being fed that, then they're going to start to believe that this is true. So we need to get much more responsibility in the media. I think there's a problem with online grooming. Some very vulnerable young people are targeted online by people who want to pull them into terrorism. Now, those of us who are older do not experience the same life as younger people. We never had the experiences you have online, and to some extent the online world is an unsupervised space. And I think we need to better understand that and engage with young people to understand what the risks are and start to deal with that. But the third point is, anytime something horrific happens, we all have to stand together. So that the Friday after the attack on Parliament, and I was one of the people that was locked in the chamber, I went down to Croydon Mosque and I stood outside there with the leaders of the Muslim community in Croydon, and we issued a joint statement condemning terrorism. And it's very important that we show we are all in this together. We all stand shoulder to shoulder, foursquare against the terrorists, and we need to make sure that the Muslim community is represented properly in the media as having exactly the same interests, aspirations as everybody else that lives in this wonderfully diverse community of ours.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. To Michael Swadling.
As has already been said, thankfully terrorism is a tiny, tiny minority, and a lot of good work's done by our security services to thwart even those people. Someone resorts to terrorism at the end of a disconnect with our society. Bringing people, our democracy functions because we are a people, we are a demos. We live by one set of rules and we put faith in each other. That's the only way our community can work. And we need to make sure that those people among us that aren't integrated, do feel a separation, can be brought in. We can be of many faiths, many cultures, many races, but we really do need to try and build one culture in this country so that people do not feel isolated and they do feel part of Britain and they feel that they can invest in Britain and they get value from this country.
Thank you. Mr. Davies, please.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Steve said on this. And I think that actually goes back to one of the points we were talking about earlier in terms of community relations between the intelligence services, the police, and those who know what's going on the ground. That's very, very important. I agree with what was said about standing together when bad things happen. I also just wanted to add, though, that there's a risk that we respond as a country by ever more draconian surveillance law, by saying we can arrest people without charge or we can keep them for ever longer periods of time. That is to go against the very values of a liberal society that are being attacked by some of these terrorist outrages. And so I think we have to not just stand together, but stand firm in our values as a liberal society, that we respect the rule of law, that we arrest people only when there's evidence, that we say that we tell people what they've been charged for. And all too often, governments have responded to these things by saying, right, we'll just introduce ever more draconian surveillance law.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Mr. Underwood.
I think one of the things, echoing, so I think we've got to make clear, terrorism and religion have got nothing to do with each other. There is no connection between the two. So all this connecting between Muslim and terrorism, there are terrorists who claim to be Christian, there are people who are terrorists who claim to be Buddhists, there are people who of all religions. There's no connection between the two, and it's some politicians and a lot of the press who keep making those connections, and we've got to deal with that. Disagree completely with Michael Swadling. We are not one people, we are a group of people. And actually celebrating our differences is the importance. Understanding what we can each bring from our different backgrounds, whether it's religious, cultural, or where we were born, it doesn't really matter, but we're all bringing something special to that conversation and working together. And actually celebrating our multicultural differences is how we actually make people feel included as part of the group, not trying to force people down one route.
We cannot dispute that terrorism is a big thing around the whole world. So as we are a United Kingdom, we should all unite together in one, instead of being differences, regardless of whatever party. So thank you for all your opinions. And now we would like to go to the audience, if they have any questions. Audience questions?
Mr. Manuel.
Hi. I think that this is a question to everyone here. So, I mean, NHS, increase in NHS spending was promised with the EU referendum and stuff, but we haven't really seen an increase. We've seen cuts, a lot of cuts, and I've heard promises of increasing spending. One of the main things is the 1p increase with tax, but how can we get a promise from all the parties that the money will go to the NHS and it's not just going to be used for something else, or it's this whole farce that we will increase NHS spending and then in the end we won't? Thank you.
Conservatives.
I guess, yes, during the Leave campaign, they did have this £350 million sign that I guess said that could be, I guess the qualification they had was it could be spent on the NHS. What I would say is we have an election today, now, and we have manifestos. So look at the manifestos and ask yourself honestly, who do you think A, can deliver what they say they're going to do, and B, has the best solutions for the NHS. Now, if they do not do what they or we or whoever's elected promises, what they promise to do, then of course in 5 years' time you have an opportunity to vote for somebody else. Now that £350 million sign, just to qualify that, it is a real figure. Britain will get £350 million or the equivalent back a week after we've left the European Union. However, how that money is spent ultimately is a decision for the government of the day, not Nigel Farage or whoever else.
Mr. Kasumu, could you wrap up,
talking about that figure? Hope that answers the question.
Mr. Kasumu.
Just going to pick up first on the EU referendum. The £350 on a bus was one of the many lies that were put about during the referendum. It is a lie. But I'm not going to refight the old referendum. People voted the way they did, but that's why we're offering people a second referendum when we actually know the real deal that's sorted out for any Brexit, so that people aren't voting on imaginary stuff or the lies that were put around during those campaigns. We can actually see what the real offer is on the table, and people get to choose. People get to choose on that, and that's the thing. In terms of the funding, I've already said about us cutting Croydon. Our manifesto will be fully costed, as our last manifesto was at the last election, unlike the Tory manifesto, which isn't fully costed. They claim to be responsible on the economy, but they haven't put the costings in their manifesto. It's not fully costed. They've just put a wish list, and they say they'll find the money from somewhere. So actually look at the manifestos, and the detail should be in there if people are serious about what their commitments are.
So just picking up on some of the points of the 350 million. I was the vote leave lead for Croydon, so I have a little bit of form on knowing about this. 350 million is the gross figure for our bill of being a member of the EU. The net figure is it works out to be more like 200 million a week. So we will be £200 million a week better off once we leave the EU. We haven't left yet, and when we leave, we can choose to spend that in any number of ways. Whichever party forms a government will have that opportunity. That is the real figure. It wasn't Nigel Farage, it was Vote Leave's figure. Just coming back to spending, promising on spending. To be fair, every government has always put up spending on the NHS, with the possible exception, I believe, of Labour when the IMF came in to take over our economy in the late 70s. UKIP, as I've already said, we've got funding we send overseas. Why not spend that here? Why not spend that on our old people, spend that on our country and improving our health service?
Thank you.
We'll take one final question from the audience. For the first one, for the next one. Sorry. One final question. Yeah.
So, as our relationships with Europe and America, some of our oldest allies, seem to be slightly in flux given who's in charge of the United States at the moment and what crazy things happens with him every day, what would your parties do to ensure that Britain has good relations with the rest of the world going forward in this new and terrifying time we find ourselves in?
Mr. Reid, would you like to answer?
I think one of the great things about the European Union, and it's one of the reasons I campaigned to remain inside it, is it's one of the ways we've kept the peace in Europe since the Second World War. Having countries come together to trade with each other is much better than countries going to war with each other. If you look at history up to and before the Second World War, there was nearly always a major war in every generation. I'm the first generation, and you're the next, that hasn't had to endure that. So good open trading relations are fundamental to keeping peace in the world. Now, we voted to leave the European Union. I didn't support that, but I respect democracy, so that is now what will happen. The issue is about the terms on which we leave the European Union. For me, we have to maintain as close a trading relationship with Europe as possible. Theresa May has said she is prepared to crash out of the European Union without a deal. That means trade barriers, trade taxes with Europe that will crush jobs and investment here in Croydon and in the United Kingdom. For me, the key is maintaining as much access to the single market as is possible. And that would be Labour's priority as we go through the negotiations. The Tories have said they're prepared to wreck the economy rather than make that commitment.
Well, I agree with what's been said. We have had a war in Europe in every century except this one, and the European Union, apart from its economic benefits, has been perhaps the most successful peace project in history. The 350 million point that was raised is very, very important because it does undermine people's faith in politics. It's one of the most mendacious, misleading claims, I think, ever made in any democratic choice. And it's simply not going to happen because if, as Steve says, we crash out of the European Union with no deal, or we don't have access to the single market, we will not be £10 billion better off. We'll be far worse off. There'll be far less money in our economy. How do we interact better? How do we interact with other countries in the world? We do so through international institutions, and we do so more strongly as a group of 500 million citizens in the biggest borderless single market in the world than we do as 60 million. And that's why the Liberal Democrats believe that you should get the choice over your future. So many people in this room, of course, didn't get a vote in the referendum. We think that 16 and 17-year-olds should have a vote. And when we see the hard reality of the hard Brexit deal, not the lies and the mendacity of the Vote Leave campaign, when we see that hard reality, people should get to choose again. And if UKIP and Theresa May have the courage of their convictions that this deal is going to be somehow so great, then they should have the courage to put it before you in a further referendum between the reality of leaving and staying in.
Yeah, one important thing to learn in life is when things go against you, move on. Move on. We had a vote. We need to now leave the EU. That's fully leave the EU. That's not say we're leaving, but actually stay in the single market. We have access to the single market. Every country has access to the single market. Many of you probably have products on you made in China, Japan, and many other countries that don't deal with the EU or not members of the EU.
Negotiated through the single
market.
market.
The great news is the World Trade Organization that we can deal with through the EU and the growing economies in the world. The EU is a stagnant economy. That's where our future lies, with those growing economies.
India, China, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Ghana, emerging markets. Europe is a big market. The rest of the world is an even bigger market with exciting opportunities. Now that we are leaving the European Union, of course, the majority of us in London voted to and campaigned to remain, but the decision has been made. We have to move on. And the reality is, when we leave the European Union, free trade deal or not, we will still trade with Europe. Europe needs us just as much, if not more, than we need Europe. Let us be absolutely clear. This is a great country. We're going to have an amazing future. We just have to make sure we do the right thing on June the 8th and not vote for a party that is going to go in there with their tails between their legs and bring back a dodgy deal. And that's what you'll get from Labour and Jeremy Corbyn.
We do not have any more time for any more questions. But, David?
As teenagers, we won't be able to vote in the election on Thursday, June the 8th. But we believe it's important that everyone in society takes part in this democratic process.
Yes. Make sure you vote on June the 8th. To help you make your minds up, we're just going to close with a very short 15-second final statement from each candidate.
Mr. Kasumu, can you please start?
So when I was 19 years old, my life changed. That's when I met my wife. That's when I became the vice president of my student union. That's when I set up my first business. And of course, when I joined the Conservative Party. Now, there are two reasons why on June the 8th you need to vote Conservative. One is because I can relate and I understand the challenges of people from Croydon North because I share a similar background. And I guess the second reason is ultimately we're leaving the European Union. If you vote Labour, you'll either get a minority group of weird people who don't believe in their leader, or you'll get Jeremy Corbyn as your Prime Minister and the worst possible deal of wrecking our future. You have to vote June the 8th.
That's all, thank you.
For Conservatives.
Thank you. Could we now go to the Green Party?
I think one of the things you've heard from all the candidates here, one of the lies is they keep telling you is you're voting for the government. You aren't. Under our electoral system, you are choosing one MP. Because our electoral system, first past the post, means that your votes don't count across the entire country. We changed that so that we have a fairer voting system. But in terms of picking who you've got, I mean, I say I didn't get involved in politics because of the fame and the glory. I got involved because I care about things. Green Party politics is about caring about people, caring about the environment and caring about the future that we bring. So the only promise I will make to you is the fact that if you elect me as your MP, or your parents elect me as your MP, then I'm going to work night and day to make this a better world for all of us, and that's what I'm committed to.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. Can you please keep it short?
Yeah. What's on the ballot paper on June the 8th is the future of our economy and the future of our public services. The Conservatives' cuts have already meant our hospital is listed for closure or downgrading. They've already announced plans to cut education in Croydon by £20 million if they are re-elected. I believe work should pay. If you go out and you work hard all week, you should get enough money to pay your household bills. You shouldn't be left to sink into debt. And our public services in Croydon deserve funding just as much as Surrey, and yet Surrey, which is wealthier, got an extra £24 million from the Conservatives last year when Croydon was cut £45 million. People's choice is a Labour MP that will stand up for Croydon, or a Conservative MP who will put his hands up to cut Croydon. And that's a pretty clear choice.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. Mr. Davies, could you just keep it short, please?
Well, if in the last year or so you've been dismayed at the direction in which our country is going, you are dismayed at the state into which the Conservative government is allowing our public services to stink, and you're dismayed that we would cut ourselves off from that biggest borderless single market in the world and from that big community of nations in Europe in which we used to be a leader. If you're dismayed by a government which has adopted wholesale the politics of UKIP, almost making them, frankly, redundant, and by a Labour opposition which has given in on all of the big issues, particularly on Brexit, then this election is your chance to change direction, and only the Liberal Democrats will give everybody in this room their say over their future with that final deal referendum against staying in.
Thank you, Mr. Swadling.
As someone that's always lived in Croydon, someone that was born in what's now Croydon North, I believe we really need to, I want your vote so that we can deliver on what was promised in that referendum that 41% of Croydon North voted for. We can get fully out of the EU. And from a personal perspective, UKIP is a party that believes in giving you more freedom. I want to be your MP. I want your vote so that at the end of the time in office, you have more freedom and there's less control by government and less telling you what to do.
Final round of applause for all of our candidates.
And so, from St. Joseph's College, in the constituency of Croydon North, we'd like to say goodbye and remind you one final time, if you're eligible to vote, to take part in this election, don't forget to vote. Thank you.